Cool. Thanks very much, Joseph. That was a great talk and a very interesting paper. And thanks, Marcon Fabricio, for the invitation. I had a couple of questions, both on the emotion side and the MVPA side. Which one would you like to take first?
Either way.
Either way. So let's start with the MVPA. So I'm very sympathetic for your claim, but I'm a bit skeptical about what MVPA can actually do. So as I understand, MVPA is a general method of analysis. It's not unique to fMRI, right? Can be used in other ways, and it's used in economics and all. And it's just a matter of detecting patterns in some data. And what's problematic is that MVPA as such is mechanism blind. So it doesn't tell you why those patterns actually obtain. It just tells you, look, there's some way of patterning. And moreover, since it uses machine learning as a method, then you really don't know why those classifiers are working. And if that is so, then I'm a bit skeptical about how we can ground ontological claims on MVPA. So maybe that's a problem if you want to defend the possibility of there being basic motions in the sense of networks and distinct patterns in the brain by using MVPA as a source of evidence.
Yeah, so there's a lot to say about the topic, and I share your concern. So the first thing I'll say is just that Carl Craver has this mantra when we're teaching inquiry in the cognitive sciences, when we're teaching about different methods, and he says, different methods, all of our methods suck in cognitive neuroscience. It's just that they suck in different ways. And I think you're right that there's a strength of MVPA over some traditional methods, which is that it's more sensitive to some patterned differences in the data, right? So there are cases where the fusiform face area looks like it would respond equally to houses versus faces, but you can, find voxels within the area that are, diagnostic of the category. So there are cases where it sort of has more information. You're right that we shouldn't reify. You're right that the patterns are sort of mechanism neutral. They don't. So that we can, that the neural signal, the bold signal, contains information that can distinguish, when you are watching a fear movie versus watching a happy movie. It doesn't say anything that the kind of causal structure of the situation is reflected by those differences. And there are many ways in which that can be a worry. So I'll just mention a few. So one of them would be, as I mentioned, there could be variables other than emotions that are actually driving classification. Another issue could be that you could fail to distinguish stimuli from each other because you say used a linear pattern classifier, and the difference that's informative between them is some kind of, higher level, higher factorial pattern, and so forth. So I think you're right that there are just a lot of worries here. You could also use, and this is a point that Jesse Wright got me onto, the voxels that drive classification in a particular setting aren't necessarily the ones that the brain uses to perform the task. And the easiest way to see that is just imagine that you had used a different classifier that might identify a different set of voxels. That's informative. And so, I think there are a lot of legitimate concerns there. And you might say, just because I can, distinguish the happy movie from the sad movie, that doesn't mean that the voxels that this classifier spit out as having the highest weights for discriminating categories is like the thing in the brain that actually corresponds to those emotions. And so I think you're right. And I think this is just kind of one of the ways that we can get information about this. So I think, the improvement over Lindquist et al. Is, they're taking regions individually and saying, well, there is no signal that we can find that can tell you whether whether the person was happy or fearful, essentially. And, this technique at least sort of points towards something and says, well, look, the bold signal is actually informative of this difference. But you're right that that's only sort of the start. And the one thing I was going to mention is maybe the successful cross-classification lens a little bit of credence. So, if you think this has nothing to do with, say, the brain basis of an emotion, well, the fact that you can sort of train it on internally generated emotions and then test it on the ones from the movie suggests that at least there's some similarity in the structure of the data between those conditions. Now, whether that's really like the emotion, is up for grabs. But I think you can see how this is at least sort of the part of a large-scale research program that could get at that. But yeah, that's a totally fair worry.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. Again, I'm very sympathetic with all your claims, so I'm going to try to play a bit of devil's advocate and try to put myself in Lindquist and especially Barrett's shoes. So there's a worry, even though we can get information from MVPA, and this might be just the start, there's also the worry that what does that information mean really? And one of the most important ideas from the constructionism camp is that there is something going on in the brain, of course, irregularities, and they don't deny that. What they claim is that those regularities or those mechanisms, those voxels or whatever, they are not emotional themselves. So they're actually instantiating what they call core affect, right? And so I can't imagine them saying something like, well, look, cool, we can find some patterns with MVPA and we can classify some things, but that just means that emotions differ in the way in which there are in the mechanisms that happen in the brain, but that doesn't mean that those mechanisms represent emotions themselves. So it's just differences in core affective states rather than emotional states per se, right? And then they would go and claim that the differences between emotions lie in the concepts themselves, right, and the constructed and so on. Would you find that problematic? How would that go?
Yeah, so there was actually a point in writing this where I started to worry about whether the really crucial differentiating factors have really been tested, with this. So let me step back for a second. So there are a couple of versions of either psychological or social constructionism, right? And I think they speak a bit differently to whether we should expect to find consistency and specificity at all. And so, okay, imagine that it's true that emotions are the product of our culture. So if you're born in the U.S., you're going to have anger and disgust and happiness. But if you were born in Tahiti, you might have those things, but not sadness, which is a claim that Lisa Feldman Barrett makes. If that's true, it could be that there would be cross-cultural brain differences, but not individual brain differences. So if that were true, it could be that within a culture, people who are roughly put in anger-eliciting situations have roughly the same brain activation patterns, even though those activation patterns, wouldn't be about anger per se. They would be about the sort of cultural concepts, core affect plus whatever cultural concepts are used. Whereas if the thesis is that even within a culture, there just is no kind of stable thing associated, right? If so if the idea is that there isn't even the same core affective state underlying different instances of anger in a culture, then you might have kind of more radical individual, between individual variability within a culture. And so, I ultimately think that whether or not a task that we take to be a good emotion or anger or disgust eliciting task has a stable pattern in the brain isn't itself really adjudicating this sort of issue. So I think, you're right that the battleground is, I think, really whether the brain areas that are redeployed, whether the best ways to understand their functions is in terms of, say, a core affective state. The one difficulty there is that I don't think that's wholly incompatible with basic emotion theory in many cases, because as I mentioned in the case of fear and anxiety in the paraventricular nucleus of the thalamus, basic emotion theory also posits that there are differences in, say, arousal. So I think basic emotion theory is compatible with there being some very recycled brain areas that are involved in some of what Lindquist and co would call core affect. So what I will say, so that's kind of the sum of the sort of worries I have. What I'll say is that to me, the psychological constructionist thesis is most compelling when there's an explicit hypothesis about what kinds of differences you ought to find between people. And so there are studies that have suggested that people with semantic dementia and damage to the anterior temporal lobes, which is considered a semantic or conceptual deficit, have trouble sorting emotions by faces. And that, if basic emotion theory is true and that we're kind of hardwired to recognize these responses, that would be problematic. So I think things like that, I think you really need specific hypotheses about either, what psychological component is involved in the construction, or what differences in, say, between different cultures you think might be constructed. I sort of think in the absence of that, it's going to be hard to find something that really supports the constructionist thesis over alternatives, which is part of why I'm I'm sort of pessimistic about, I'm trying to say, in effect, look, like the fact that there doesn't seem to be, in neuroimaging data, structures specialized for basic emotions isn't actually like a very crucial test of these theories. And so in some ways, this is conceptual ground clearing to where the points of dispute really are. I'm partly trying to say where the points of dispute are not.
Joe, thanks for the paper. As you can imagine, there are all sorts of things that I really agree with here. I guess one thing that I started to worry about over the course of the paper was something like the cult heart worry. Although I certainly wouldn't want to put it his way, which I guess is like a stressing an autonomy of psychology kind of way. But I did have this concern with the MBPA study, and it's just something. There's something vaguely, I don't want to say circular, but there's something floating around in this that doesn't quite sit with me, and it's that maybe it's the way you put they design the stimuli to elicit fear. Well, but of course, the constructionist folks don't think that when you try to elicit fear, what you're eliciting is fear, right? Just like they think when we recognize a face that looks like fear to us, we're not actually recognizing this distinct category of fear. So, I mean, one possible way to respond is to say, sure, you gave them some stimuli which tend to do a thing to people which we tend to categorize as fear, but that's just an issue, right? No one has to deny that there's going to be different stuff going on in those different stimuli and so forth, right? What they're going to deny is that what those stimuli are tracking is something like fear versus anxiety versus whatever. So just the fact that there are situations presented in the movies that you can tease apart with MBPA sounds to me like it doesn't actually maybe say that much about whether the thing that's being recognized is the pattern that's being classified as a fear pattern or not, right? And if you take this worry to generalize, then maybe you do end up at something like the cult heart skepticism, because unless we have an independent way of establishing whether the stimuli and situation really are fear situations as opposed to some other category, then we're not going to know what actually the pattern's sort of picking up on.
Yeah. So I think there are a couple. There are a couple strands of the comment that I want to follow up on. One is actually that an objection that I've been sort of more on about since I read the paper is actually one. So the psychological constructionists often actually make a claim like the one that you said, that maybe you can only get what appear to be biomarkers of emotions in these cases where we are kind of driving people to be in a very extreme or particular version of it. And so they claim that, studies of facial recognition will use sometimes like actors who emote like really extreme versions of the emotion. And so it's kind of like, if you have actors who are like, oh, versus like, ah, then of course people can, distinguish those as like fear or surprise and disgust or whatever. But if you have more, the range of variation that we actually experience is quite subtle. So that's sort of on the face recognition side. And you might, I think that is a good worry, that the psychological constructionist need not say that what we take to be the fear eliciting situation would be neurally identical or neurally indistinguishable from what we take to be the anxiety eliciting situation. So I guess one thing, so there's a couple things to say. One is that I think we do need to sort of pull apart some of these different strands, because it's at least possible that the psychological constructionist maybe should be surprised that the neural classifier trained on the open-ended prompt to imagine yourself in a fear situation can actually then kind of map well onto the elicited fear situation, because they claim that there's a lot of variability between distinct instances. Now, as I mentioned, that finding itself wouldn't be worrisome, though, for maybe the person who thinks that these things are pretty fixed within a culture but are really variable between cultures. So yeah, I think you sort of need to pull out different strands of what kind of construction are going on. But yeah, I think that is it is a really good worry, about whether these prompts to whether the stimuli to elicit fear are really getting at anything like the ecological range of things that we take to be fear. The other thing I'll say is that there are attempts to use MBPA to develop a neural pain scale. So Tor, Wager, and actually Linquist has been involved, but there's this effort to develop a neural signature of pain. In the same way that I suppose here this would be like a kind of baby step to a neural signature for anger or something like that. And there, it's acknowledged that this could be all kinds of things other than pain, right? So the original studies basically burned people with like does this make you hurt to a 3, a 5, a 7, and a 9, and then used MVPA to see if you could distinguish the degrees of pain based on the neural data. And then they found that, and this network seems to kind of fit with the pain matrix that people have identified with like the periaqueductal gray and the ACC and things like that. But then they started getting worried about like, well, is this a heat-induced thermal discomfort classifier, or is it like a pain classifier? And I saw a recent review article, and they had something like 20 different contrasts between pain and like everything else, like individual contrasts between pain and sort of all the other things you think could be going on. And, sort of like, it's, cold-induced pain seems to do it, but not chronic pain, and all these just different contrasts. And so, yeah, you might. I think it's a completely different and fascinating philosophy of science question whether that like gives you something like a validated scale. But I think if you don't embark on something like that now, sort of like almost, that was in 2012, 2013, so they've been doing almost like 5 years of trying to validate it or something like that. I think if you don't, you probably can't say too much about whether the signature you're identifying is really a signature kind of the emotion.
Yeah, it also seems that important dimension is how infuriated you are at being intentionally burned.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, so I mean, I'm largely on board with that. I mean, just a quick follow-up. I mean, one thing you might say is there's kind of two different parts to the constructionist view, and some they might be willing to give up to retain others. So, I mean, it might be that they could say, okay, well, it shows it's not as inconsistent from context to context and individual as we thought. But it's still another step from there, I guess, for broadly these same kinds of worries, to saying that, now we've got the basic emotion, and you do sort of hedge that, I think, appropriately at several points. So,
did you want me to speak to the Coulthart point a bit?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, what I'd say about the Coulthart point is there's something deeply right about it. So Coulthart put it in this strong way, which is like, psychological. It's kind of a Fedorian point. It's like, psychological kinds could be implemented in a billion different neural ways, and so brain data doesn't really contradict the psychological theory. It just contradicts one particular implementation of the psychological theory, and I think that's right. So, the idea that, so imagine you had like one brain area, right? The emotion lobe, and it performed in different contexts in a Bernsteinian way, the basic emotions. So in mad eliciting situations, the emotion lobe gets angry, and then disgust eliciting situations, the emotion lobe is disgusted, right? Well, Lindquist et al.'s study would have said, there's no brain basis of, there's no brain signature that differentiates these things. But that wouldn't mean that basic emotion theory was wrong. It would just mean we were wrong about the idea that those emotions would have to map onto different areas. And so, yeah, the big point I tried to hammer on in my dissertation is that, like the ability our theories about how cognitive functions localize to the brain are really bound up in our ability to test psychological theories with fMRI. And so, yeah, you might think that we're just going to sort of go through 5 generations of this, the sort of univariate regional generation, the multivariate network one, then the like temporal one where we realize like, oh no, it's not actually just these patterns in space, but it's like how these things, oscillate or whatever. And yeah, I think that's a good worry to have. But I think it sort of fits with the methodological dependence line that I'm trying to push.
Cool.
Thanks, guys, and thanks, Joe, for great talk. Very much enjoyed it. And, abstracting away from all of the interesting details, one thing that I really liked about your paper and your talk, that it shows that sometimes when people come up with these overarching concerns and say, well, basic emotion theory is doomed, your good analysis does an excellent job showing how things usually are more complex and subtle than many people make it sound like. Now, as Dan said, I'm going to second him basically and say, of course, there's much that I agree with, but in my comments, I wanted to restrict myself to 2 main issues. One's a fairly minor point, and one's a little more philosophically substantial. So let me begin with the minor point. In the talk and in the paper, you draw a distinction between locationism and regionalism. And I think, I believe I understand what's driving you, and I agree with your general point. My fear is that this is a point that can easily be misunderstood. And so I would actually say, this is a very minor and tangential point, but I would not draw this contrast, because where does locationism end and where does regionalism end? And I think your point is, look, of course, these patterns are instantiated in the brain, but they're not instantiated in specific regions. But exactly where these regions, how big these regions are, where they begin, where they end, is a controversial matter. So my fear is that people might end up misunderstanding your point there. It's like, look, we're back to the neo-phrenology assumption and so forth. So here's my nagging concern is that this is a point where people might end up misunderstanding you, and I would suggest you just use a different expression. At the same time, this is annoying because I think authors have a sacred right to cherry pick their expressions. If you like to talk about location but not regionalism, then be it. But I feel that you can draw a sharper contrast there. So this is a fairly minor issue. A more substantial, not concern, but question that I have is, well, can be summed up as follows. What is a biomarker? Because you yourself acknowledged very early on in the talk that biomarkers play a crucial role in the argument in the paper. And I got interested in biomarkers actually a while ago, not through my work in neuroscience, but through my work in molecular medicine. And it's my understanding that oftentimes when we talk about biomarkers in psychology, in neuroscience, we kind of piggyback on what goes on in other sciences like medicine, like biology. It's like, yeah, it's because this is not originally or traditionally a neuroscientific concept. But when we look into how biomarkers are used in biology, I don't think there's a clear sense or even a clear consensus about what these biomarkers are. And when I ask you, tell me more about what you mean by a biomarker, I'm not playing the annoying philosophical game like, give me a definition. I want necessary and sufficient conditions and so forth. I don't think we can expect that. But it seems to me that a lot in the debate you're raising hinges on how we treat biomarkers. Let me give you a few examples. Can we allow locationist or regional biomarkers only, or would MVPA expand biomarkers? And that to me is not clear. And I think a lot in the debate you're discussing hinges on that, and you touched upon it. Can we accept voxel patterns as a kind of biomarker? If the answer is no, then of course MVPA almost analytically cannot solve these disputes. Or this is not something you talked about in the presentation, but I think I caught parts of this in your paper. Do biomarkers only show structural, or can we also apply them to ultimate causation, evolutionary issues? How far do they extend? Are we looking for neural biomarkers? Can we allow psychological biomarkers? And I think a lot here depends on how exactly we cash out this notion here. So again, I'm not expecting a definition or a precise set or necessary sufficient conditions, but I would like to, or I would encourage you to say a little more about what you mean by a biomarker itself.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate both questions, and yeah, maybe I'll be in touch a bit about how to have a more felicitous phrasing, because I actually think this sort of regionalism versus locationism language is something that has actually caused confusion among readers, and so yeah, maybe I'll just see if you have thoughts about the preferred phrasing. I mean, you're right. It's hard because the term a brain region is itself an ambiguous term that could refer to anything from a sulcus to a cortical column or something. I mean, and it is sort of arbitrary. I think in the paper I mentioned here that I'm using region to refer to sort of the size of a typical ROI or something like that in an fMRI analysis, but of course that's then an arbitrary unit, and so yeah, you're right to worry. If Anderson's neural reuse paper had said, look, I divided the brain into into 4 lobes, and every lobe seems to be involved in a whole lot of functions, the paper probably wouldn't have gotten such a buzz, but dividing it into the couple hundred or whatever areas that are sort of similar to the parcellation schemes or whatever in the Human Connectome Project, then maybe that's more interesting, but leaves unresolved these issues of whether there are finer grained distinctions. And yeah, I mean, one thing I'll say about that is that some basic emotion theorists actually do favor we need to sort of subdivide these further type strategies. So there are papers that say that, well, the anterior insula really has these subdivisions that are discuss specific versus not. And so yeah, that's a terminological issue, but also that masks an issue that is major, but that I sort of sweep under the rug in this paper to talk more about, whether basic emotions could share functional components, just mainly because, part of the reason I wanted to point things out, like, facial action code sequences for anger and fear can share action units, is that basic emotion theorists themselves, so people like Hamann, who are sort of defenders of basic emotion theory, actually often take neural overlap to be a problem. They're like, yeah, this seems problematic for us, whereas I think they should sort of full-throatedly say, no, this isn't really an issue. So that was part of that was the main thing I was trying to deal with. But yeah, I think that issue of, regions and so forth lurks in the background. So in the paper I give, and I really, I like the biomarker question. So in the paper, I think fairly crude about it. So I take a biomarker to be some kind of biological structure, for lack of a better word, that is consistently and specifically associated with the thing that it's a marker of. So, a blood-based marker of, type 2 diabetes would be something that everyone with type 2 diabetes has, the blood sugar in that range, and then only people who have type 2 diabetes have the blood sugar in that range. Now, as I say that example, it reveals all of the kind of problems with that, right? So you can have, a blood sugar range that is shared between, say type 1 and type 2, diabetes or things like that. And yeah, so I think there's several issues that are raised. And in general, part of what it points to is sort of how consistent or so both consistency and specificity are, I take it, graded notions at the end of the day. So it could be like 19 out of 20 times when you're mad, this structure is evoked, and 40% of the time this structure is evoked when you're mad, but not when you're sad. So there are many things like that. And I kind of take, so the psychological constructionists often talk about, a biomarker really needs to be this, like a fingerprint. A biomarker for an emotion really needs to be like a fingerprint is kind of the running metaphor. Like, every emotion has its own specific set of, responses in the same way that every person has an individual fingerprint. But yeah, I can see how if you push really hard on those notions like consistency, so I'm now claiming, I suppose, if I'm allowing for overlap, that the sum of the signature for anger and fear would be shared, even though some of it is different. And then you're kind of saying, well, what is a biomarker then? Is it something like just how much similarity is enough? And yeah, that's a really difficult. So yeah, I think I should think harder about this question of what we really want out of biomarkers. I mean, the way I've been thinking about it at times is with analogy to things like, and people have been looking for neuroendophenotypes of psychiatric disorders. Some people say, oh, we haven't found any of these things for, say, major depressive disorder. So maybe major depressive disorder is, sorry, bumped the thing off. Maybe MDD is not a good category because we can't find a neuroendophenotype for it. And other people say, no, we just sort of need to look harder or something like that. So that was sort of an analogy I wanted to draw at times during the paper. But yeah, I think you're right that more needs to be said about a biomarker than that it's a consistent and specific signature or pattern.
And I'm more than happy to follow up on these issues because I've been thinking about them for a while. We can talk more if you'd like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right that it's an idea that I kind of borrow from biomedicine. I'm going back to like the Torr-Wager pain scale. So I actually am happy with a multivariate pattern being a biomarker. If it turns out that there's a multivariate pattern in the brain that, tells you that someone is in, pain, and that it's somatic pain as opposed to other things, then I take that, maybe to be an okay candidate for a biomarker. So yeah, I don't think there's any problem. One question that came up actually so I was recently teaching a paper that I alluded to in here, the Lenardowitz and co. Paper where they tried to see whether you could use a pattern classifier to distinguish different cognitive control constructs like response inhibition and working memory and task switching. And someone said, hey, look, what if these things were really distinguishable psychological constructs using like discriminant and convergent validity, measures applied to just behavioral stuff, but then they weren't distinguishable neural patterns, like why would you take the brain data over the psychological stuff? So you had mentioned like psychological markers. And so, yeah, I think there's also this question lurking in the background of whether looking to the brain is somehow, getting closer to the heart of matters than just whether these things are psychologically dissociable from each other or identifiable. So,
especially because voxel patterns are not in the brain, they're in the computer. I'll leave.
They're in the machine.
Well, in a sense they are, and of course they're connected to what goes on in the brain, but the connection there is not obvious. It's not immediate, just like the connection between a DNA signature and a lab result. Neuroscience is more interesting and more fascinating in that respect. But I think that raises some issues that at some point will become crucial for your argument to go through. And I agree with you. The argument is a good one. And those are good examples of biomarkers, but the basic question remains, what are we looking for?
Yeah, fair enough.
Thanks a bunch, Joe. I actually got some people together in the Rotman Institute to watch your talk, and it was great.
Oh, cool. Awesome.
So I have a question about the MVPA stuff, and what I was wondering is, so we know with MVPA, junk in, junk out. Pick n number of categories, tell your MVPA classifier to divide them into that many categories, and you get that many categories out of it. So what I was wondering with the basic emotion MVPA classifier, you're telling it to look for 4 basic categories. Has there been a cluster analysis done with the patterns without telling it how many categories it should look for, and then done a cluster analysis on how many very similar clusters within the MVPA data a pattern classifier would group, so that we could say, instead of coming in and saying, are there 4 basic emotions and can you tell them apart, could we say to the pattern classifier, how many clusters of responses in these brain regions are there, and can you reliably distinguish them? And then test whether the clustering that happens does or doesn't map onto the number of emotions that we are theorizing. And would that seems like a better independent way of testing whether or not there's a respect for basic emotions of the categories we're using or not, as opposed to the kind of, if we tell it to look for those, is it able to find them? So do you know if they've done anything like that? What would you predict if there hasn't been, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so it's a really great question. And actually, one thing I wanted to sort of bring on the table that was also raised by Marco Nathan's comments were that some basic emotion theorists actually don't think that, so psychological constructionists think that different instances of what we would label fear are like very neurally and biologically different from each other. But actually basic emotion theorists in response to the sort of problem from variability or the lack of one-to-one correspondences have sometimes adopted the notion of emotion families. So the idea being that actually anger is not like one exact set of facial expressions and physiologic signatures, but a kind of, I suppose, a cluster of these things, a tight cluster of these things in some kind of high-dimensional space. And so that was just a little bit of a prelude. So I'm not aware of attempts to look at, say, just elicit a bunch of different emotions and see sort of how many clusters you can extract from the data. The main sort of follow-up so far to the Saramaki and colleagues paper was actually a critical paper by Barrett and Satput, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, and Polner and Clark Johnson. Yeah, those are some of the authors. But they actually simulated neural data and applied a pattern classifier to it, and found that you could kind of extract, you could distinguish some of these things from each other, even if they didn't really have the exact same set of underlying voxel patterns. And so, yeah, I think it's a really good worry to have. And as you mentioned, the number of categories that you specify, if you had told the classifier, to sort this according to 12, categories rather than 8, you probably could have also had above chance classification. So yeah, I think that should be done at some point. I'm not aware of it having been done, and I agree that it would be informative. Yeah, so that's all I can really say about that issue. I'd be extremely excited to see someone take that on. I wouldn't really hazard what it would look like.
Thank you again, Joe. That was a really interesting talk. I wanted to sort of push on, apologies if this is sort of a basic question. I'm sort of new to this area, but I wanted to sort of push on sort of an Evo-Devo aspect of emotion here and sort of get your sense of what are the explanatory targets when we're talking about the differences between sort of basic emotion theory and social constructivism or whatnot. Because I could see, on one sense, if you want to posit that there's some sort of like ontologically basic set of emotions, those being the targets of sort of natural selection and BET having some sort of comparative edge in explaining, okay, that they're sort of handling the evolutionary side of it per se. But the social constructivism side, I could see then handling the development. So if you want to connect the sort of the feeling of emotion with the actions that then express it, surely we would want to say that, okay, it seems at least a basic fact that people in different locations are probably going to express emotions differently, even if just qualitatively. We might not make the full claim that, oh, people in this region don't experience sadness or don't experience anger, or make a big claim like that, but there's differences in how it expresses. So what's this, I guess, two questions then are sort of what's the targets of explanation here? Is it just the feeling of the emotion? Is it just sort of the patterns of brain activity, or is it connecting those with the behavioral pattern? And sort of what's the Evo-Devo picture here then for basic emotion theory versus social constructivism? Because it seems sort of straightforward, at least on my way of thinking, that of course the development of behavioral patterns of expressing an emotion are going to have a social and cultural context. And I don't see anything sort of problematic with that in that sense.
Yeah, I don't either. So there's a lot of room for middle ground between sort of the most extreme, sort of basic emotion view and the most extreme, maybe social constructionist view. And so, as you said, it's possible that, for one, it's possible that we have, through development, some set of, emotions like anger or disgust, but that the particular ways that those are expressed will, vary with culture. And of course, the idea that there would be basic emotions like anger or disgust doesn't mean that there are no emotions that are primarily the product of culture. So you could say that maybe, disgust is pan-cultural but differentially expressed, but Schadenfreude is not pan-cultural. It's distinctively German. And so people really do occupy this sort of range of views. I think what's surprising about the kind of new wave of psychological constructionism is the kind of denial that everyone, has, anger and fear as sort of evolved or biologically basic emotions. So they point to really interesting work questioning whether Tahitians have sadness as we know it. They seem to sort of have words and concepts that lump sadness together with being ill and low energy and things like that. And also, interestingly, have like sort of high suicide rates, which some people think is because they don't really talk about sadness as such. But then, yeah, so I think, but the harder part of your question is what is or should be the target, right? So if by the emotion you mean the feeling, then you might say that, everybody feels qualitatively the thing that's like fear, but they express it differently. But then the basic emotion theorists were trying to say that actually, no, the suite of responses, including the facial expressions, are what's constitutive of the emotion. So then what you take to be sort of constitutive of the emotion will influence what you think whether you think there's one emotion or not, or what you think the target of explanation is. And so that sort of like Dan's question, I think gets very tricky very fast. So you can ask a bunch of questions like, Ledoux and people seem to have identified neural circuits that are indicative of some kind of, avoidance versus a stereotypical freezing behavior. But you can ask whether those are do those really map onto like anxiety and fear as we know it? And that's a kind of criticism the psychological constructionists have had of the inference from the animal model research. So yeah, it's a really thorny set of questions. And I suppose one question that Isaac Weidman, who's a really great philosopher of the emotions and of cognitive science, has dealt with more than me is to what extent is basic motion theory really committed to completely stereotyped responses? Because if they say, fear is this exact set of facial expressions and behaviors and physiological stuff, then, any variation seems to kill the theory. On the other hand, if they can avail themselves of, oh yeah, these are all fear, but they're just really variable ways of expressing it, then the empirical content of the theory that discriminates it from, say, constructionism seems to be watered down. And that's just an incredibly hard kind of question, is how you strike that balance.
Fair enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there anyone else between yes and these, even in the Rothman Institute, who is willing to raise another questions? Because I have some comments. I will just put forward one. I work a lot on that university. We had lots of fun with Joe, but also with Juan Loaiza. We talked a lot about this. I really enjoyed this talk. And now, a funny thing about the basic emotion theory is that, as far as I know, there are these very, very fearful and very sanguine defenders of psychological constructionists, but there are basically, it's very hard to find someone who is actually defending basic emotion theory among the neuroscientists and the psychologists. There are but very mild defenders. So basically, it ends up with philosophers like Joe or Andreas Carantino defending basic emotion theories, while neuroscientists seem just to have no more interest in that. And since we have to do this job with this fascinating one, we can maybe go back to Ekman. And there is a funny thing, I think, about Ekman, is that I agree with Joe. Ekman says almost nothing of what they charge him for. There is lots of strawman. There is a big strawman about the basic emotion theory that is assigned to Ekman. But I think at some point Joe told that the overlap is no problem. The neural overlap might be no problem for basic emotion theory. Actually, while I read the paper, I thought that it could be something more. I mean, one of the commitments that Ekman, one of the milder claims of Ekman against Plutchik was that you have no blended emotions. That is, basic emotions are categorically distinct with no blurred boundaries. So either you experience fear or you experience anger, but you cannot be in mixed states. So you can think that, given that overlapping means that this might mean that if the neural machinery used to implement fear cannot be used to implement some other emotion, that can be seen as very consistent with Ekman's original claim that the basic emotion are in an out-out situation. Do you share this view? It's not canonical, but perhaps it might work.
Yeah. So, by the view, do you mean the view that you could not be both, angry and afraid at the same time, by dint of, in this case, maybe the neural resources being, partially shared between them, such that you can kind of only be contributing to one or the other?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that seems about right. Yeah, I agree with that, and I also think it just highlights something else I wanted to mention, which is the idea that I actually agree with. So the psychological constructionists say all over their work that we need to think harder about the ingredients of emotions. So that, their claim is that, emotions are constructed from, basic ingredients like core affect and our concepts and our individual learned experience, in the same way that like a cake is constructed from, it's the flour and the batter and the eggs. And I actually think that basic emotion theorists also need to talk more about the constituents of emotions and more about the ingredients. And so I think that asking the kind of question like you asked is an invitation to say, well, hey, can thinking about, what the ingredient that's shared between anger and fear is, and then whether that bears on these kind of core initial commitments basic emotion theory. That seems to be a project that, say, PANCSEP is carrying out in sort of neural kind of systems level stuff in animals, but that I rarely kind of see in like human psychology. So yeah, I think it points towards something that basic emotion theorists need to do, which is kind of embrace this ingredient talk. And I think really the difference between basic emotion theorists and constructionists there is not that there are ingredients. It's one about whether the key ingredients are these domain general cognitive functions that have nothing to do with emotion, as one was saying, or whether the things that we concoct out of these ingredients are at all stable, whether we make cakes on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or if we only make cakes sometimes and most times we make tarts or things like that. So I think those are sort of two ways of approaching emotions that come out of this that I think are productive. It's not so much about whether there are ingredients, it's about what they may be and how they are combined and recombined.
So real quick comment and quick follow-up. On the question about cluster analysis that someone asked before, the Sarimaki study did the cluster analysis. Just if you want to check it out. That's how they select the categories. Yeah, but now just a matter of question, maybe following up on what Marco just said. I was wondering, just a matter of general curiosity, because a lot of the constructionism point of view, it's also to push the claim that emotions do not differ from other affective states in any relevant sort of way, right?
One?
Sorry, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
my
your video just
connection
dropped out.
is flaking a bit. Quick question. Do you think that basic emotion theorists should worry themselves with showing that emotions differ in some important respect from other affective states? Or would they just go with the constructionist view that that emotions and other affective states just don't differ, and whatever we find, for instance, in the case of MPA, can also apply to other effects? Like, do we need that distinction?
Yeah, so first I'll say to the cluster analysis point, I will obviously have to look into that. I think it's a little strange if they were to then give so I think if the results of a cluster analysis were given the labels of emotions, that would probably be, yeah, anyway, I'll just have to look into that and see whether, see what.
Behavioral data, the subjective reports stuff, that did the cluster analysis, and then from there, did the brain.
I see. Yeah. Excellent. Thanks. That's helpful. Yeah, I think the concern was whether the sort of category labels that they were given for the neural data, whether you could have extracted those clusters from unlabeled stuff. But to the second point, so I think Isaac Weidman as a philosopher might be one of, but I'll just say there's a debate within sort of basic emotion theorists, or at least people who are sympathetic, about whether we should actually just think of emotions more generally as drives. So there are some views on which the sort of way that we would, account for, the fact that, what we call like instances of fear or anger can have different, behavioral manifestations, but express what's common to all of them, is to say that the common thing is a drive state akin to hunger or thirst or other sorts of drive states. That is a kind of, so in that way, you would say that emotions are not, basic emotions at least, are a form of drives, and that drives are interestingly different from other bits of our psychology. So that's one way that you could go. But I think basic emotion theorists should have some answer to what it is that make emotions different from other bits of our psychology, like just memory or perceptual goings on. And I take it that part of that work is done by the connection to the sort of felt or bodily nature of it, so the control over bodily viscera and things like that. So I think if something, the basic emotion view, wasn't involved in the control of our visceral system, then it wouldn't be an emotion. Yeah.
So, well, maybe this is the one thing I could just say, and maybe ask you to say more, and it follows up on something you were saying a minute ago, is, you know, core affect theory is a pretty sparse set of dimensions, right? And it's weird because because you're friendly to Anderson, but in Anderson's book, he's very friendly to the idea of psychological dimensions, the idea of cashing out, talons, whatever that acronym is, in terms of their contribution to psychological dimension. So following up from your answer to one of the questions a minute ago, I'm now kind of like thinking, could you have a more, just a bigger set of dimensions that maybe needn't map on to just valence and arousal, and would, if the constructionists were open to that sort of move, like would that help them with regard to the MVPA results? Is there an angle here? And then ultimately, like, would the views kind of come together in the middle in some sense? How should we think about this kind of middle ground, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think so in the replies to, so when I see psychologists emotion researchers in particular, who are not defenders of basic emotion theory, but are defenders of appraisal theories or other sorts of, other cognitive theories of the emotion, but not this form of psychological constructionism. The main complaint is that these sort of two dimensions of valence and arousal can't, can't explain the differences between, say, anger or disgust, and can't, be the only sort of dimensions along which core affect would vary. And so, yeah, I think you're right that there's this view if you get into current emotion research, which, in some ways I was sort of philosopher of neuroscience first, who got interested in the emotions as a case study, and I realized, like, man, emotion theories, you could disappear forever. But yeah, there's this view. The philosopher William Melanson gave me this really beautiful metaphor, and he said, it seems sometimes like the constructionists are, trying to adopt a true sort of multidimensional model, where it's like, instead of talking about emotions, we have, I don't know, maybe 16, independently toggleable underlying, dimensions, and each one is like a light bulb that can be, dimmed or brightened, right? So we've got, like many modifiable components and many shades of intensity of those, and that instead of having these discrete prepackaged, like you put the CD, like the Ekman view is like you put the disgust record on and it plays the disgust song, and then you put the anger record on and you play that, but really that what we have is this kind of sifting sea of changes in all of these things. So yeah, I think that if there's some appeal to that kind of view, and I think it's sort of fair enough that valence and arousal are not, on any case, are not going to be the only underlying dimensions, even if we sort of want a dimensional view. I think there are a couple of questions there which would be, it's actually similar to debates in the philosophy of psychiatry about dimensionalized versus categorical views of psychiatric disorders. So the people in the psychiatric kinds lit will say, if there's no zone of rarity, between the two extremes, if the extremes just kind of blend into each other, then there's no real category here. But if somehow in this complex space there are clouds, because there are intermediate positions that are not occupied much, right? So you could imagine, on one hand, you got the 16 knobs that are all the shaders, and they can occupy any of all 16 can be set to any of their settings, and we happily are in all of those states unbeknownst to us all the time, would be really different from, it turns out, like, when this knob's turned, all the rest are in this situation. When this knob's turned, all the rest are in this one. But also those things shade a bit, right? And so, yeah, I think it's generally sort of difficult to think your way through the kind of balance between dimensional and categorical views of psychological or psychiatric kinds in general. Yeah, because there are sort of variations. But what I would say is the two major questions for me, if I had that dimensionalized view, if I sort of started with the like, yeah, we've got 16 knobs and they can all be shaded to 20 different degree settings. I would say, yeah, the interesting questions are, do they form clouds in this multidimensional space? And I think for the psychological constructionist, does the forming of the clouds have anything to do with our upbringing, basically? Because it could be that things are massively dimensionalized, but in a way that's not really dependent on our culture. So maybe like when someone says, I can't remember the term, I think it's something like, people will, Barrett talks about all these emotion terms that our culture doesn't have, but sometimes I relate to them pretty well. So, maybe what that means is that we all have this, highly dimensional variation. And, then when people provide a word for it, it's just that. It's just a word that points to some region of this multidimensional space versus, no, our concepts and our words and our way of talking about emotions are actually what are carving off these things from each other as we experience them. And I think those are quite different. So yeah, that's the range of things I have to say about the dimensionalized views, which I think are very much on the table, actually, given the range of variation.